Discrimination was very prominent in those years. Promoters never gave the black fighter the opportunity that he justly deserved.
He quietly used his position as heavyweight champ of the world to make sure that when he went to movies and they put him in the front row and he saw that blacks weren't allowed to come in, he said, I'm not going in there unless blacks can come in there.
They say great to me, it's Joe Louis. His fights counted, every one of them. And the way he ended them, I don't think that there was anybody in the history of boxing who was a greater finisher.
You know, poor black families that would get hope from just saying, hey, Louis did it. They would tell their kids, I don't want to hear that you can't do this. Joe Louis did it.
Joe Louis Barrow was the seventh child of Alabama sharecroppers. His family fled the Jim Crow South with millions of others in the Great Migration. They settled down in Detroit. When the Depression hit hard, Joe had to drop out of school and follow his brother to work at the Ford factory. Joe's job was pushing truck bodies onto a conveyor for $25 a week. Those factories sculpted steel. That labor sculpted Joe Louis. By the time Joe left the factory, he was state champion, prepared to go pro. 200 pounds of American muscle. A puncher you could measure in torque and displacement. He goes 20-0 when he took his giant step onto the world stage. Face down the 6'6", 260-pound former champion, Primo Carnera. Carnera was a circus strongman, taught to jab and uppercut. They called Primo the Ambling Alp.
Primo Carnera was the ex-heavyweight champion. It was Louis's first fight in New York, so he was on center stage for boxing, but boxing only was a stage for other things happening in the world then. Italy was a totalitarian government. Carnera was seen as the representative of the Mussolini government.
The 4 inches and 60 pounds didn't much matter to Joe. Joe Louis had the power to move mountains or chop one down like Jimi Hendrix. Because of the height discrepancy, Joe had to throw his overhand right like a fastball. His next demolition job came against another former champ. Max Baer was a showman. In the ring, he often growled, taunted, and talked through fists, while his technique was wilder than drunk Deontay. Max was built like a tank and hit like one too.
May the better men emerge victorious.
Joe Louis respected his power because he respected things and people in general. The highest respect Joe could show was to get rid of Max Baer as fast as possible. Dr. Louis was in, gave Baer some headache medicine. Max would take 2 and call him in the morning.
It was a hard fight. I was up against a very good man, and a man will go a long way. I wish him a lot of luck and happiness in his marriage.
Yeah, it was a tough fight, but I better have the toughest fight home every night.
He was a finely tuned machine, destroying anybody that stood in front of him. Leave it to the German to pick apart the engineering. Max Schmeling was supposed to be on the downslope, but claimed to see something in Louis's style.
Max, from watching Joe Louis in action and in pictures,
Have you detected any particular weakness in the brown bomber?
Yes, I did. But I won't tell.
The bookies saw a mismatch. Joe took time off training to imbibe in his only vice, golf. Joe showed up out of shape and absolutely sure of himself. Schmeling did in fact have the skills and savvy to see something. When Joe pulled his jab back, it dropped to his chest, leaving him open to the cross counter over the top.
Everybody fight. A ripping right by Max Schmeling. Lewis is in trouble.
Max landed time and again.
Lewis goes down. Still on his feet here in the 12th round, but Max is all over them.
Joe ran out of gas.
A ripping right to the jaw. A dynamite right, and Lewis goes down. Max Schmeling puts a temporary halt to the meteor.
Joe returned to the drawing board. All the flaws in the first model were ironed out. Never again would he take training lightly. Never again would that jab droop to his chest. Joe put together another 8 wins and 7 KOs when he got the news. He'd earned his title shot. A pivotal moment in the career of any boxer, but Joe's title shot was about more than a belt. The first black heavyweight champion was a man named Jack Johnson. Jack was as fearless as he was peerless. He knew he'd be hated regardless, so Jack lived a life of a habitual line stepper. When he finally lost the title 7 years later, the establishment was so thoroughly offended by Johnson's conduct, the color line was immediately redrawn. It stayed drawn for 22 years.
There was almost a conspiracy not to let another black near the championship. It was the white man's championship. They could win other divisions. They weren't the heavyweight champions. The heavyweight champion was a white province.
Until Joe Louis stepped in the ring to face the Cinderella Man, James J. Braddock.
His managers took the unprecedented step of publicly announcing a code of conduct for their fighter, designed to distance Louis from the memory of Jack Johnson.
Joe was anxious, tried to bomb him out early. Braddock buckled the brown bomber on a crafty counter uppercut. Joe was up before the ref could start a count. Joe settled down into his usual economical assault. He calmly, dispassionately broke Braddock down like the color line. The genius of the finish only comes through in slow motion. If you look carefully, the hook Joe leads with lands on the inside of Braddock's left arm. This knocks all of Braddock's defense out of the way and leaves him dead to rights. Nowhere to go but down. He might still be laying in that ring had his corner not carried him off. Joe was the only man to ever knock Jim Braddock out in 80 fights. Joe was adamant. He would not call himself the champion until he settled his business with the German who reverse engineered him. Max Schmeling was caught up in history. Being a German athlete in the late 30s was a precarious position. By all accounts, Max was an honorable man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Max was Germany's champion whether he wanted to be or not. The rematch was the most hotly anticipated fight in history.
The greatest sociological event held in a ring in the history of boxing. Might have been in the history of sports. It was a preview of the war to come. It was Max Schmeling representing, albeit he was never a Nazi, the Third Reich. He had gotten letters from Adolf Hitler exhorting him to go forward and win. Joe Louis had been at the White House, and Franklin Roosevelt had felt his muscles and said, "Joe, we need these muscles for democracy."
And the entire world's focus was on this fight. That's true. This fight was the biggest fight in the history of the world.
You had all these terrible people with Hitler that were putting out that they're the master race, they're this, they're that. And now you had the biggest sport in the biggest country and the champion of that sport, the heavyweight champ, Joe Louis. And he's fighting the German fighter, Schmeling, the second time, now for the title. And of course you had all these people that were, their job was to promote it. And they come and they're saying, we will show the world that we're superior. And there's no better way to show it than in a ring.
That night, 72,000 screaming fans did something no American audience had ever done before. Cheered a black man to defeat a white one. That night, one voice would cry out far louder than any crowd. It was the voice of Max Schmeling, screaming as Joe Louis opened up on Max like the arsenal of democracy. Broke his back. Joe put him in the hospital for over a week in 2 minutes and 5 seconds. Hit him so hard, Max's vertebrae started bleeding. Joe visited Max in the hospital afterward. Without the pressure of clashing superpowers and ideologies to pry them apart, these good men became fast friends. When America went to war, Joe enlisted immediately at great personal cost.
He went into the entertainment division. I mean, there wasn't any real intention of seeing him out on the front lines. He was somebody who was there for morale purposes.
Joe's last title defense before shipping off came against Abe Simon.
Heavyweight championship bout for the benefit of the Army Relief Fund.
Private Joe Louis Barrow reports for duty. With tears in his eyes.
He donated his entire fight purse to the war effort. He fought over 90 exhibitions during his time abroad. He was put in the same segregated unit with Jackie Robinson. It's estimated nearly 2 million Allied soldiers saw the brown bomber box in person. Joe personally donated over $100,000 to the war effort. That's $1.5 million in modern money. Sergeant Joe Louis Barrow went back to his humble peacetime occupation of giant slayer.
Successfully and stop Bob Pastor in the 11th round.
But by then the odometer had ticked over. Besides, Jersey Joe Walcott was a giant slayer himself. Walcott's shifty style was a problem for Joe's deliberate, ponderous punching power. Walcott got him to walk onto a counter right in the first that dropped him. It went from bad to worse in the fourth, when Walcott worked his wizardry once more. Joe was in the hole early and did the damnedest to dig his way out. When the cards are read, Joe Louis squeaks by with a controversial split decision.
The heavyweight champion of the world, Joe Louis.
They had an immediate rematch.
It's the champion's 25th title defense over a span of 11 years, and his last fight. As Louis comes to the ring, the entire sports world is wondering, can Walcott beat the Brown Bombers' second time around jinx? Will Joe Louis retire undefeated, or will there be a new champion? Ring on.
Walcott dropped Louis for the third time. Joe Louis would only knock Walcott down once, because once was all he needed. It was his 26th and final defense. If there were any justice in this world, Joe Louis would have retired with a single loss on his record. But unfortunately, greed had different ideas. Joe was exceedingly charitable, and the IRS was not. All that money he donated to the war effort also included the taxman's share. Joe owed a 7-digit debt with compound interest and made 6 figures a fight. Joe fought on with no choice. He knew no other trade. Like Boxer from Animal Farm, his only response to insurmountable strain was, "I will work harder," until they sold him to the glue factory. Rocky Marciano was the glue factory. Rocky threw heat and applied pressure until heavyweights turned to goo and re-solidify on the floor. The name Marciano alone is a spoiler. He never lost a fight. Tonight was no exception.
Left by Marciano, working on the body with his man pinned to the rope. You can see that Louis feels those punches. A big hunk of which goes to Uncle Sam for back taxes. Marciano gets $50,000. Louis moving a little better in this round, but again, watching, you'll see him miss again with a hard right uppercut. Courage and heart alone, backed up by that effect. Lewis lands a left jab, followed by a left hook. Both good punches, forces Lewis to the adjacent strands.
It took a great fighter to convince Joe he wasn't one anymore. But it's a terrible lesson to learn in public against your will.
To finish him off. Now watch. A left, another left crumples Lewis. A blazing right, and Lewis sails through the ropes.
By the end, Joe had only his friends and his name. Frank Sinatra got him acting gigs and a job as a greeter at Caesar's Palace. He died shortly after a massive stroke in 1981. He had no money for a funeral or even a burial plot. Two old friends couldn't let Joe go out like that. Ronald Reagan toured with Joe during USO shows for the troops. The commander-in-chief waived the requirement of active duty service, so Joe Louis could be buried in the most hallowed of American ground. His funeral expenses paid for by an old friend who flew in from Berlin, despite an achy back, to lower the greatest of the greatest generation into cold earth and warm memory. So if you find yourself at Arlington National Cemetery in D.C., by the tomb of the unknown soldier, make that solemn walk down to the grave of Joe Louis. When you pay your respects, stand at attention. Salute, because few men in American history are more deserving of it, because he bled for his country, and all it did was bury him.